every year, the House of Representatives passes dozens of bills that it knows cannot clear the Senate and therefore cannot become law. These are called messaging bills because their purpose is to send voters a message about what the bill's supporters believe, not to change public policy. Some commentators say that these messaging bills stand in the way of desirable compromise and befoul the climate for agreement in the future. But I don't think it's that simple. Sure, messaging bills sometimes crowd out compromise, but when they're used as cover bills, they can also facilitate compromise. What is a cover bill? It's a messaging bill that is designed to protect its supporters from political backlash when they eventually settle for a compromise. To show you how they work, I want to walk you through the story of how Kevin McCarthy used a cover bill to get Republicans out of a tight spot. This is the story of the 2023 debt ceiling negotiation. The debt ceiling is a legal limit on how much money the United States government is allowed to owe at one time. You can think of it like America's credit card limit. In January of 2023, the United States hit the debt ceiling, and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen warned that if Congress did not raise the debt ceiling by early June, America would go into default. That would mean a recession, the loss of millions of jobs, and a stock market crash. Raising the debt ceiling requires an act of Congress, and in 2023, the Republicans controlled the House and the Democrats controlled the Senate. That meant that there was no way to raise the debt ceiling unless at least some members of both parties were on board. Republicans were willing to pass a bill to raise the debt ceiling, but only if that bill also included significant cuts to government spending. Democrats, on the other hand, wanted to raise the debt ceiling without committing to any cuts. The big question for Republicans was how big of spending cuts to insist on. And the problem was that no matter what they demanded, they were going to take an electoral beating. If they demanded too steep of spending cuts, Democrats would say no, the country would go into default, independent voters would blame Republicans for the economic chaos, and the Democrats would crush Republicans in the general elections. But if they didn't demand steep enough spending cuts, conservative primary voters would accuse Republicans of failing to take the national debt seriously. Then those Republicans would lose to more conservative challengers in their primaries, and those more conservative challengers would get clobbered by the Democrats. And here's the really nasty part. There was no Goldilocks demand. Any demand big enough to satisfy conservative primary voters was going to get rejected by Senate Democrats. So how do you get out of this? You guessed it, a cover bill. On April 19th, just a month and a half before the June deadline, McCarthy led Republicans to pass the Limit, Save, Grow Act. This bill was a conservative wish list. In exchange for raising the debt ceiling, the bill would cut federal spending by $4.8 trillion, defund the Biden administration's $80 billion investment in the IRS, and block Biden's student loan forgiveness program. It was opposed by every single Democrat who thought it cut too much, and a handful of Republicans who thought it didn't cut enough. But the vast majority of Republicans voted yes, so it cleared the House. But the bill had zero chance of becoming law. Biden immediately declared that he would veto it, and in any case, it would never even get that far. Senate Democrats refused to even schedule it for a vote. No problem for McCarthy, all part of the plan. He let the weeks to the June deadline tick away. With 3 weeks to go, Biden invited him to the White House to resume negotiations. At 2 weeks to go, Democratic leaders publicly backed off their demands for a clean debt ceiling increase. At 1 week to go, McCarthy and Biden finally struck a deal. With just days to go to save the country from default, one of McCarthy's lieutenants unveiled the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It would raise the debt ceiling in exchange for just $2.1 trillion in spending cuts, a $1.4 billion reduction in investment in the IRS, and more modest limitations on Biden's student loan policy. Because Republicans had passed the Limit, Save, Grow Act and stuck with it until the country was on the brink of default, they had proven to their primary voters that they really did want to make bigger cuts to government spending than they eventually got. It provided them with political cover to support the compromise, the cover in cover bill. That's not to say the compromise made everyone happy. Some Republicans believed it was the best they could do under the circumstances, but there were others who thought it gave up too much ground. Some Democrats thought it was an acceptable price to pay to avoid a devastating default, but there were others who thought it cut too much. But whatever its shortcomings, it had a crucial advantage that no other bill considered so far had: enough votes to pass. It cleared the House on May 31st, passed the Senate the next day, and was signed into law just in time to meet the deadline. The Limit Save Grow Act, the cover bill, paved the way for this compromise, in part because it changed how Republicans who opposed the compromise explained their opposition. Here's Sean Hannity.
As conservatives point out, the budget cuts are small, not enough for some Republicans. Remember, their bill cut $4.8 trillion.
The important part is that he's reminding everyone that House Republicans had tried to go for bigger cuts. When we look at the press releases of House Republicans who oppose the compromise, they usually bring up the cover bill too. Here's an example from Representative Barry Moore. The so-called Fiscal Responsibility Act promises to saddle Americans with $4 trillion in new debt and kick the can down the road for 2 more years. This is a massive disappointment and a far cry from what Republicans passed in the Limit Save Grow Act. So even the people who were bashing the compromise were with the very same breath reminding everybody that House Republicans had tried to get a more conservative bill. That made a big difference for what Republican primary voters thought about Republicans who supported this compromise. To show this, a PhD student and I ran an experiment where we took real Republican primary voters and told them about this debt ceiling crisis and about the compromise that ultimately resolved it. And then we showed them an excerpt from a press release, just like the excerpt from Barry Moore's press release that I just showed you. But here's the experiment part. Some of them saw a doctored version of the press release that removed the reference to the cover bill. Then we asked them, how much do you like Republican members of Congress who supported the compromise? It turns out they like them a lot more when they hear about the cover bill. If you're a Republican member of Congress and you're deciding whether to back a compromise, whether the House passed a cover bill first and gave you the opportunity to show primary voters what it is you really think, makes a real difference. The Limit Save Grow Act was a messaging bill, a performance put on for the benefit of Republican primary voters. But that performance created political conditions where Republicans and Democrats could work together to solve a real problem. And I think this debt ceiling negotiation teaches us a broader lesson about how you can't cleanly separate theater from substance. What other people think about you constrains what you can do. So, if you want to get things done, sometimes you have to put on a show. That's all for today. If you have any questions, please ask in the comments. And also, I'll be making more videos, so if what's on the screen right now looks interesting to you, be sure to subscribe so that you'll get a notification when that next video comes out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.